Well, today we're right at the turning point in the book. This would be right smack dab in the middle of the book, where we move from the language of grief, uh, the prophetic imagination, which uses the language of grief to try to first of all, critique what Brueggemann has been calling the royal consciousness. The language of grief shakes people out of their numbness. And this is what Jeremiah was able to do so well. Um, but now the transition is going to be towards the language of energizing and the language of amazement. And the focus here is going to be, as you can tell by my little graphic, on the prophet Isaiah. And I'd read this transition last time, but I'll read it again. But this is Brueggemann making it very clear to us that he himself is moving into you know turning the corner away from grief and towards you know uh, the language of amazement and engagement. So the royal consciousness leads people to despair about the power to move toward new life. It is the task of the prophetic imagination and ministry to bring people to engage the promise of newness that is at work in our history with God. And this promise of newness, of course, harkens all the way back to that newness that was experienced by the Hebrews in in their throes of slavery in the midst of the Egyptian empire, where God, a God of freedom, chose to draw them out of that slavery and give them that new life in covenant community. That, of course, eventually 250 years down the line was undermined by what we're calling the royal consciousness. So these two things are being, pitted against each other. When the royal consciousness is established, how do we get it back? Well, a lot of how do we get the new covenant, the covenantal community back? And this is the way that we're going to do it, according to Brueggemann. Um, so that's really where we ended last time. Do you have any questions or comments about this? Okay. Well, let me try to get rid of this here if I can. No, that's the case. I'm sorry. I'm having trouble with my graphics here.
Dan, could I have a quick question?
Yeah,
I had to miss last week. Did you discuss the uh, book that appears in the Bible that's called Isaiah and what it consists of, and first and
yeah.
second and third and maybe fourth? Did
No, actually, I'm
did
going
you
to
get
do
into
that.
that?
I'm going to do that today. We
Okay,
concluded we concluded Jeremiah uh, last week and got to precisely
great.
this point, this image that I'm showing you, if I can get it back. Uh, got to no, that's the image I need. Sorry, everybody. Uh, Brueggemann's going to start with this idea of what the royal, reminding us exactly what the royal consciousness does, and that is this exclusion of hope. It's this numbness that kind of takes over not only the poor, and denying them entry into the prosperity that is completely and continually slipping away from them. This is what was so important about Amos. The Amos, the first 8th century literary prophet that spoke to the kingdom of Israel. He saw Amos saw this injustice that was being practiced really by the kings and the aristocrats, to the point, where the idolatry was such that people were selling the poor for a pair of sandals. And, it's trampling the head of the needy, says Amos. And this leads to a kind of despair on the part of those uh, who are at the lower echelons of society. But, and this is the interesting thing, that this hopelessness also finds its way into the minds and the lifestyles of the aristocrats as well, the king and people of the temple, because what they want to do is maintain this status quo, right? And there's nothing new that they can look forward to. If something new would mean change. This is the curse of conservatism, isn't it? We want to conserve what we have. We want to conserve the status quo. And so it really ends up being a kind of hopelessness. And Brueggemann does something here that's really kind of anachronistic, but he continually moves to talk about Ecclesiastes as representative of the Solomonic Empire. Now, why do I say that's anachronistic? Because we know, or our scholarship tells us, that Ecclesiastes was most likely written after the Babylonian captivity as part of a collection of literature known as the wisdom literature. But it so beautifully reflects what we see going on, and it represents the royal consciousness so perfectly. And this kind of despair, this kind of hopelessness. If you look at how Ecclesiastes begins in chapter 1, you're not 4 or 5 verses in before you hear this. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has been already in the ages before us. So this idea that history has once again become kind of cyclical. And this was the great innovation of the Hebrew Bible. It's in itself, this is the great innovation of God, that when you choose people in the freedom of God, and you choose people who rest in that freedom, history becomes linear history, because your will is something that can be expressed individually, choices can be made, and new things can come along as a result of those choices. Now, the pagan communities at this time lived in this kind of cyclical merry-go-round, you might say, this carousel of time. And what they needed to do is precisely what Brueggemann is talking about. What they needed to do was sacrifice to their gods in order to maintain the predictable nature of time. We want to know that winter comes, and then spring, and then summer, and then fall. We want to know that when the Nile floods, we can plant our crops. We want to be able to predict and thus, in some ways, kind of control all of that. And the Hebrew people in Egypt, and it goes even back to Abraham, when God says, I want you to go to a place that I'm going to show you, all of a sudden, something new enters the equation. Abraham is going to a new place. Abraham, in his, with his individual will and the choices he makes, is going to discover something absolutely novel. And when that happens, then we can start to determine time along a timeline. Time becomes linear. This is where we were. And as we progress, now we are in a new place. So we're kind of on this linear time. That reflects the freedom of God. What doesn't reflect the freedom of God is that cyclical nature of time, which ironically, the monarchy, the royal consciousness, wants to try to move back to. We don't want anything new. We want to be able to predict what's going to happen. And because of that, Brueggemann, and it's really an excellent point, makes the point that they too, the monarchy, the aristocrats, the priests in the temple, they're caught in a kind of hopelessness as well. So any comments about that? Go ahead, Will. Do you want to say something? Oh, okay. I just saw you move and open your mouth. I'm going to say something here. Um, Anybody else? Well, I thought this quote was good, and I'll read it for us here. In concrete terms, technological, agricultural, and other social advances are impeded in aristocratic monarchies because the taxes, the tithes, the tributes and tolls, the rents, the confiscations drain all of the peasants' resources and rationale for creativity. Why, why do we need to be creative, right? You know, only the technology, and this is so relevant to us right now, right? Only the technology of warfare advances at a more rapid pace because that contributes to the expansion and control of the king. So I need not remind you where our military budget is, and add on top of that our immigration and customs enforcement budget, which I hear, if I'm not mistaken, is another 50% larger than our military budget. I find that hard to believe. Is that accurate? Does that anybody know?
No,
It's not accurate.
no. The Defense Department budget, I think, is right now about 750 billion, and in spite of the increases for ICE in the big bad bill, uh, whatever. Um, I can look that up real fast for you, but
Uh,
I don't think that's even close
no,
because
it seems to me to be. I don't know where I was picking that up, but it seems to me to be unreasonable, unrealistic to think that ICE has that much money, but they have an exorbitant amount.
I mean the little green men, are expensive, but cannot compare but to the Air Force, the Marine Corps, the Army costs of and Navy, for gosh
Yeah,
sakes.
yeah,
Whoa, I mean that's huge. And now we have a new proposal from Trump that he wants to increase the defense
military
budget to 1.5 trillion, I think I
trillion.
saw.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, no, I don't think
yeah.
so.
Um, but isn't this exactly what we're talking about? The technology of warfare advances at a rapid pace. Everything else seems, I feel a sense of despair, especially after recent, I can't remember when Renee Good was murdered. Was it last Thursday? Had we had a chance to talk about that yet?
Wednesday, Thursday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it wasn't on my radar when we had our last discussion. Um, but the presence of these people in our cities, I mean, it's just undermining democracy. And in democracy, I think people, I mean, that has been the hope of our nation, hasn't it? That we as a people are stronger than any individual and we can decide how to govern ourselves. Um, that has been completely lost. And, the wheels of the military move ever onward. Um,
The interesting thing, Dan, is pre-Trump, you know, I guess having come out of the service experience myself, that the U.S. military at the top, for the most part, was a very, very well educated uh, group of Americans, and had the greatest respect for separation of the military from civilians. And what Trump has demonstrated in less than a year is how fragile all of this is after
yeah,
250 years if you quit believing in it. And 77 million people, for whatever agendas they had at the polls, have simply quit believing in it. So, I think I have to look at pre-Trump, in a totally different landscape.
yeah.
I mean, where was, Jimmy Carter and Lyndon Johnson and, imperfect people, but
Yeah,
a long ways from this.
right. Yeah, go ahead, Will.
I just wanted to add, since you brought up the woman in Minneapolis, Reverend Gregg said yesterday at noon Bible study that she has very strong Presbyterian connections.
There's a
I didn't
connection.
realize
Well,
that.
well, there's the connection with domestic terrorism right there. Yeah. The Presbyterian Church USA, yeah, I mean, it's really a bunch of wild
Radicals.
rebels. And
You can you can really see where we are in this. I mean, Brueggemann has never been more relevant than right now, and we're not. Of course, we have the task before us of trying to uh, energize and speak out and use the language of amazement theologically, but also we're in this context of democracy where the same type of paradigm can be used where we draw upon the symbols of our past, you know. Um, just the symbol of the American flag, for example. I'm really kind of upset that that's been co-opted by the Republican Party to mean something other than, you know, it's come to mean it's come to be a sign instead of a symbol. It was a symbol of democracy, a symbol of the Constitution. It was a symbol of, you know, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But in recent years, really, you know, when people started wearing it on their lapel, right, it's just become a sign, a very two-dimensional kind of thing. What will it take for us to recapture and to, uh, you know, re-energize, you might say, the original meaning, what I believe is the original meaning of the flag? Um, I'd love to fly a flag on my, you know, the front of my house. I don't, I think if I put it up, people would see it as one thing and not what I mean it to be. Are you with me on this? I mean, do you know what it, when we go back to sign versus symbol, um, I really, it's become kind of a trigger kind of thing. Um, so anyway, so
Dan,
yeah, go ahead.
again, I served under that flag, and I'll be darned if I'm going to let, a bunch of Trumpers, you know, put me down for putting that flag out, on appropriate occasions.
Right, right. I agree. I agree. Um, So our task is really twofold in a lot of ways. Go ahead, Constance.
Oh,
You
I
want
was
to?
just going to say, you see it now, for instance, flying on people's trucks, and you just think thug.
Yeah, right. You know, and for this reason, despite what you said, Denny, and I agree with you, I really think our hope lies in the military. I really hope that that educated cadre of you know generals and majors and people who took an oath to the Constitution and renew that oath and understand what it means are we probably shouldn't get into politics here, but I hope that if there's any opportunity to kind of build ourselves up from the ashes, I I think it lies in the military, people who've you know who've lived this. Uh, And so that's all I'll say about that. But I do have great respect for the military, even though I tend to be rather pacifistic uh, in my approach to the world. But that doesn't mean I can't respect the people who dedicate their lives to, um, you know, to that career. So anyway, we have a twofold duty as prophets, that to our country and that to our religion as well. Any other thoughts? This this despair of the royal consciousness is a despair that is really represented by uh, in Psalm 137, when the people are in Babylon. We lay down our instruments. We can't sing songs of Zion anymore. We lay down and we wept. And should I ever lose sight of thee, Zion, may my hand wither, may its artifice be lost. Uh, there's no arena in the royal consciousness for the articulation of grief, except when that royal consciousness is itself destroyed by Babylon, right? This is what Jeremiah was witnessing his whole throughout his whole prophetic ministry. Suddenly the kings are gone. Suddenly the infrastructure of the king and his and the temple itself, that is gone. And we see how completely chaotic this is in the mental health of the prophet Ezekiel. He doesn't know what to do, right? Because he had placed so much of his hope, so much of, I should say, so much of his identity in the fact that here he was, this emerging young priest. He had a life of sacrifices ahead of him, being part of the royal court and everything. And that just goes right out the window, and you can see him, I'm not a therapist, but you can definitely see him fall into some kind of, mental illness, eating scrolls and, all of that, visions of beasts in the air and things. Um, but there's no arena for this articulation of grief until Babylon. And the first articulation of that we see in Psalm 137. I utter despair. And there's also, I don't know if you're aware of this, and perhaps I shouldn't even bring it up, but um, there's something that appears in the Psalms, unfortunately, quite often. But let me just read it for you. But you'll see just how despairing and how angry the people are as well, especially when I conclude the psalm. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps. For there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked us for mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. And now you have this almost this hope, this angry hope for retaliation and revenge. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down to its foundations, talking about the temple. O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. These, these are early images of what we might call a revenge fantasy. And I think there's aspects of that revenge fantasy that continues to find its way into Jewish thinking. We certainly see it in the book of Esther. If you know about Esther, the queen who saves her people, but if you read the conclusion of Esther, chapter 9 of Esther, you see how the Jews, and this is in a Persian context, they go on a rampage. They go out and start killing people in towns. And, and of course, we know this never happened, but this was part of what we might call this revenge fantasy. And that's when a prophet needs to arise, right? Don't let your despair become, caught up in violence. Anger and violence are the last vestige of a despairing people. And for this reason, it's important for that the prophet Isaiah enters the scene with words of comfort, as we're going to find out. So, are you aware of as the Esther um, revenge fantasy, as I call it? It's important for us because Project 2025, again, back to politics. Project 2025 has its own little sub-project called the Esther Project. You familiar with that? It basically basically is the blueprint for what is happening now in Gaza and setting the people of Israel on, on their on a safe foundation, according to them. So we're still seeing images of, of scripture in our daily experience. Any thoughts or comments? Well, now Brueggemann is going to talk about how to penetrate this despair, how to penetrate a despair of people yearning for a homeland, crying out in grief, crying out in anger, hoping for the destruction of their enemies. And he basically says there's three ways we can do it. And they build upon each other. The first of these is to offer symbols. Again, using that imagery that I'm talking about when we look at the flag, not speaking about these symbols in the present tense, right? Because those can easily be co-opted by the royal consciousness, and then made thin and unimportant, right? But to reach into the deep memory of the people and draw out images that can give them a sense of hope. And the idea here for Brueggemann is probably the most important symbol of this is God's, what he calls his promissory address to the people. It's on page 64, if you'll let me read it here. I'm just going to read the whole paragraph, if you don't mind. Actually, in my notes on the side of the book, I have a little note that this is what Martin Luther King Jr. was able to do so well, and reaching into those deep memories. What a commission it is to express a future that none think is imaginable. Of course, this cannot be done by inventing new symbols, right? You can't invent those things. They have to well up from the deep memory of the people, for that is wishful thinking. Rather, it means to move back into the deepest memories of this community and activate those very symbols that have always been the basis for contradicting the regnant consciousness, the royal consciousness. Therefore, the symbols of hope cannot be general and universal, but must be those that have been known concretely in this particular history. We're not talking about general archetypes. We're talking about very, very specific archetypal images, right? And when the prophets return with the community to those deep symbols, they will discern that hope is not a late tacked on hypothesis to serve a crisis, but rather the primal dimension of every memory of this community. There is almost a genetic memory there that has been lost. The memory of this community begins in the promissory address to the darkness of chaos, to barren Sarah, and to oppressed Egyptian slaves. The speech of God is first about an alternative future. So, it's not just the promissory address of the people in Egypt, but, to Sarah and her barrenness, and who leaps with joy, who laughs when she hears that, her despair has turned into new hope, right? And if you will, it is the promissory address that brings order out of chaos in the very beginning of Genesis, that there is purpose here, that there is order and things are just not falling apart always. So Brueggemann wants to say that this symbolic offering, reaching deep down into the caverns of our unconscious and pulling up symbols that have been glossed over, this is the real world. The royal consciousness is the unreal world. The royal consciousness is the world of veneer, you might say. But this is the world of who we have always been. This is where our deepest humanity can be found. So, thoughts about that?
Dan, were the Hebrew prophets peering out of a very small space? Let's call it the Israelites. Um, how were the Greeks and the Persians and the Babylonians, very clearly, I don't think felt this way. And to me, politics, I've tried to tell people that politics is really about values. And politics is simply the tip of the spear. It's the organization of values. And it's those values down below and where the heck they came from that I wish the world were, I keep telling myself, I wish the world were different. I wish it were Walter Brueggemann's world. But
Yeah.
darn, I look at the last 3,000 years of history, and most of us know our values well enough that we stay out of biker bars, at least intentionally, because a lot of what we hear in there it would just scare the dickens out of most of us listening
Right.
in to this today,
Right.
I think. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that?
Well, if I could just encapsulate what you're saying, it's when we look at the trajectory of history over the last 2 or 3 thousand years, violence and aggression and anger and oppression seem to have won the day almost completely. And are we just throwing up? Are we hoping in something that's ultimately hopeless? Is that kind of what you're saying, Denny?
No, I'm just saying that change tends to come, for me, I tend to see change coming around the edges and, infused with social change and demographic change and the move toward cities and what I call the culture of survival, in which people become so interdependent because they're living in specialized economic or labor markets, going clear back to agriculture and 10,000 years ago,
Mhm.
that, there's always this tussle at the edge that sometimes, and this is what I think Walter Brueggemann's missing, is prophetic imagination works best almost when the royal consciousness is broken, either from outside or in the case of the French Revolution, maybe,
Mhm.
uh, that allows daylight opportunity for a new basis of power to emerge. But it's, when I look at the little green men right now, uh, if these are the peasants that Walter Brueggemann is talking about, I don't want to be in the car when they start smashing car windows and doing what they did to Renee Good.
Right. A couple of things that I thought of while you were talking is the the Hebrew tradition. If you take the story of Abraham at face value, we don't know that historically that happened, but that is, I mean, he was on the outskirts. He was a person who was on the edges, right? On You had the walled city and their agricultural technologies and the diversified labor and highly organized infrastructure. But God called Abraham away from that and said, I want you to go to a new place. I mean, metaphorically as well as geographically, right? I want you to experience something new. And this idea of going there is an expression of Abraham's freedom, but it's also an expression of God's freedom and faith in humanity. And I agree with what you're saying that it's almost as if the prophetic imagination has to go through that fiery brook, as it was referred to, theology, Feuerbach, of grief and despair before, and then destruction, before it can get to a place where hope is even possible, where, out of the ashes, we can pick up some new symbols or some symbols that have been long lost. I don't want to say new symbols, symbols that have been long lost. But then how do we keep that from becoming another royal consciousness? That's the hard part, you know. Because we will see very clearly after this, after the Babylonian captivity, if we read Ezra and Nehemiah, what do the Jews, as they're now being called, what do they want to do? They want to go right back to Jerusalem and establish another royal consciousness with with the temple at the center, with the king who's really basically powerless. Um, but then on the edges of that, as you're saying, Denny, I really like that imagery. You have other people who are saying, didn't we learn anything the last time? You know, uh, the freedom of God can be expressed, and this is where the wisdom literature becomes so important. Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and some of the wisdom psalms. That the book of Job, for example. Don't try to put these chains on God. Don't expect God, to be predictable like the royal consciousness is predictable. Uh, and that is eventually the perspective that Jesus comes out of. I mean, who did he rail against? I mean, who were his opponents but the Pharisees, who were very, very, legalistic, um, among others. But the Pharisees were certainly the ones that found him most challenging, you might say. Any other thoughts about this? I appreciate your thoughts very much, Denny. Well, let's another way to penetrate despair is by drawing on those symbols, but then also bringing those to a public expression of hope, that which was unable to be expressed before because it seemed almost an embarrassment, right? Now, in the ashes, can be something that can, pique people's interest and pique their ears. A public expression of this hope is no longer an embarrassment, because there's nothing but embarrassment all around you as you're lying in the ashes of Babylon. So that language of that hope, Brueggemann says, is very important, that this be very lyrical. We're not going to fall back on that philosophical language or that, psychological language or that narrative that was associated with the royal consciousness. We've heard enough of that. We don't need a refrigerator repair manual. We need to sing songs. We need to remind ourselves of the songs by the rivers of Babylon, right? They're asking us to sing, and Isaiah, as I'm about to introduce, I'm going to give you the inspiration to sing those songs. And those lyrics must be theological lyrics as well, that emphasize God's sovereignty as well as God's faithfulness. There is in this a continuing invitation to grieve, but to rise out of that grief and to return to an understanding of God's faithfulness. Now, as I was reading this part of the book, I couldn't help but think about the role that folk singers were able to play in the 60s in the midst of the civil rights movement, how their lyrical expressions with music added, people like Bob Dylan, and were able to give people a just kind of new dimension to their experience. And what a powerful movement. We've not seen anything like it. Now I'm sounding like Donald Trump. We've never seen anything like it. We've not seen anything like it since that time. So, I mean, I think the Black Lives Matter movement, the Wall Street, anti-Wall Street movement, were all important. But the civil rights movement was incredible because of this language of prophecy that was able to be introduced. And then finally, when you penetrate this despair, you're also introducing a newness that redefines who people are. We are a new people. We can speak metaphorically about our hope, but we also need to speak concretely about our newness. Very important, the two sides of the same coin. We are in a redefined situation now. We're back to square one, and we're remembering who we once were. The numbness has worn off, the gloss has been removed. We are now a people standing in the glory and in the freedom of God. And we don't want to go back to the old Jerusalem, but we don't want to lose sight of the Jerusalem either. And everything that it stood for in terms of its, ideal. So with that being the case, the language of amazement that this engaging, energizing, prophetic energizing uses is a language that speaks out against despair in the same way that the language of grief was able to challenge and speak out against the language of numbness. And the person who best represents this language, according to Brueggemann, is the prophet Isaiah. Now, this is where we can get to what Mac had in mind when he was talking about first, second, and third Isaiah. Mac, do you want to begin with a question, or are we good for now?
No, I think we're good. It's if you just pick up a Bible and you don't know anything about it, it says Isaiah. It's not titled First Isaiah, Second Isaiah.
Right.
It seems that most people know that. I think that
I don't know.
but I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure either if they just read them together. I mean, but scholars would say, and I'm sure this is what you're going to go into. Historical contexts are completely different.
Sure.
But also the concept, especially as it relates to messiahship, is so different that if people don't understand that there is a real dichotomy here, they just don't get it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that's what we want to talk about. I mean, if you read the prophet Isaiah, and Mac, maybe I have a more dour view of human nature or their interest in the Bible, but I don't know that most people know about first, second, and third Isaiah. But for those of you who do, let's just remind ourselves that if you read the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah really begins to prophesy around the time of the divided kingdom when Israel falls to Assyria. Now that would have been 722 BCE. But then you have references, very clear references that sound like, Isaiah is talking to people in Babylon. And well, that guy's been living for 150 years now, right? And then after that, you see references to the people who have returned to Jerusalem. And so now you've got a person who's at, 200 years old. And I know that there are some people who say, well, those were biblical times, those people lived a long time. Oh gosh, spare me, spare me that. But what Isaiah was a tradition that had its source in the temple priesthood itself. So we call it the Isaiac tradition. And it's divided in this way. Chapters 1 through 39 are what we call first Isaiah. And there's beautiful imagery, by the way. I mean, this is where we get the city on the hill. In the days to come, they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. I mean, that was an image of energizing and amazement that gave hope to the people who were living under an Assyrian conquest, right? Look, the virgin is with child, or the young woman is with child. And by the time that the child comes into his own, those firebrands that wanted us to join them, they're going to be, long gone. That was language of hope that Isaiah was using. We're not really sure what how this tradition fared up until the time of the Babylonian captivity, because most of it comes from around 722 to about 690, 690, 685 BCE. But then all of a sudden, almost like, a shoot rising up out of the stump of Jesse, you get this incredibly gifted, impassioned person doing just what Brueggemann is telling us that needs to be done, offering new hope, offering a way of speaking out, a newness that is about to take them over, right? To emphasize and to, I guess, regale, that's not the right word, but to rejoice. That's a word I'm looking for. Rejoice in God's faithfulness, a faithfulness that was not lost. God was always faithful, but now God also has the freedom, the radical freedom to change. And this is what Isaiah wants to offer to the people, lying by the waters of Babylon. So that was second Isaiah. And this is where we get the image of the suffering servant, by the way, which we probably will not get into here too much. But this was a way of letting the people know, look, there's a new thing that you're doing. You, as the people of Israel, you Jews, were not meant to be, a part of this royal consciousness. You were not meant to have kings, and you were not meant to, you were meant to be something that was an alternative to that, right? As Denny says, you were meant to live on the edges. Your father Abraham lived on the edges. And we started out after Egypt to live on the edges, but then it all became centralized in Jerusalem with the king and with the temple. And, though he had no comeliness that we would recognize him, he was led like a lamb to slaughter. Yet we have adopted that as Christians. Well, this is a reference to Jesus. Well, no, it was primarily a reference to the people of Israel and this new calling that they had to demonstrate God's faithfulness and to demonstrate God's love for the world. This is what second Isaiah was able to do so well. And then when the people returned to Jerusalem, this would have been the time just before and during Ezra and Nehemiah, up to about 450 BCE. Third Isaiah comes onto the scene. And third Isaiah is really quite interesting because you see the influence of a new type of literature called apocalyptic literature that is present in some of the prophecies of third Isaiah. So when we look at Isaiah, we see a really nice 200-year representation of the way the thought of Jewish thought, if I can call it Jewish, progressed and developed over time. So, um, do you want to add anything to that? Anybody? Mac, that was a pretty short overview of Isaiah, but you know, I guess that's where we'll probably have to stop. But Isaiah was. I'll just read this brief, these bullet points here. But there are three characteristics of Isaiah, and I'll come back to this. But there's a genuine innovation that he introduces, and it's almost like the dross or the tarnish on fine metal has been wiped away, and there's this newness of time. If we can use what we've been talking about, time all of a sudden becomes linear again. There's a progression. There's something new towards which we're moving, right? And there's an experience of God's radical freedom. And God has the courage to change, as we know from the very first words of Isaiah chapter 40, second Isaiah, I should say, verses 1 through 2. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that her warfare is ended and that her iniquity is past, is pardoned. I can't see what I have written here. That her iniquity is pardoned. Excuse me. Let me say that again. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned. This is a changed God speaking to what we hope will be a changed people. So what comments do you have before we head off into our week, the last half of our week? Anything?
Dan, I'm thinking it depends on whom is defining God.
Well, yeah.
And just looking at, where Christianity is, in the United States right now, it is really cleaved, it seems to me, between, the people who see God as a marionette, as a puppeteer, um, and
Yeah.
those of us that see God as possibilities.
Yeah, right, right. And it goes back to what we were talking about, the God in the box of the royal consciousness, the God who is a talisman, the God who is, a manipulable tool of the power structure. And that is an affront to God. Freedom is the defining characteristic of who God is. And this is why freedom as the core of democracy is so important as well, for me, at least. Other thoughts?
Yeah, Dan, I was going to just say Brueggemann to me has really helped my understanding of how this all kind of works, in that it kind of goes back to the common definition of what's a prophet, and most people have it as, a fortune teller type of thing.
Right.
But really, what Brueggemann, I think, argues is that second Isaiah takes us back to the promise traditions of Abraham, of Moses. It takes us back to that. And when it's New Testament time, and I think he gets there in chapter 5, it's the same thing. It's not a prophecy of Jesus, and people like to read that around Christmas time. Oh yeah, second Isaiah, that just is a prophecy that predicts Jesus. Well, it's more of an explanation or an interpretation than it is any kind of prediction. And I really have enjoyed Brueggemann, reading him, because he's made that a lot clearer to me than it ever was. I think my theology professor 50 years ago was trying to tell me that, but I'm not sure I ever got it. But
Well, I agree. And like have said, this is maybe the third or fourth time I've read this book, and and it always is enlightening, always very eye-opening. And it's certainly not the traditional understanding, well, not the common understanding of the prophets, right? And as we will see, it clearly places Jesus in the tradition of the prophets in every way. You know, we like to think of Jesus as prophet, king, and priest, but if I was going to have a first among the three, uh, the prophetic tradition would be number one for me. Uh, but we use those metaphors almost interchangeably. I'm not so sure that's a good idea, but I'll go there some other time. Um, well, thank you, everyone. We will meet again next week.
Where should we pick up, Dan?
Oh, I am on page, well, the language of amazement on page 67. It's where we got to, basically. Actually, yeah, so that's the major section that we can start at, page 67, the language of amazement.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you. And I hope to see you again next week. Really appreciate the time we spend. So.